Hi, Isabella. This is Ira, and I'm recording here some audio feedback on your Literacies of Struggle paper. My hope is that this feedback will be useful both in your own ongoing thinking about what literacies of struggle are and what they're for, and also in your final project as you're making an argument that in some way contributes to or builds on or helps explain literacy of struggle to a real audience. So basically, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read back through your paper again and highlight some things that I thought were especially strong, and then also ask you some questions that I hope are sort of like usefully prodding in one way or another. First of all, I just wanted to say I thought this was great. I really appreciated your thinking it through in a really careful and I think really useful way. And so basically, the way that you organize this paper is around the idea of the struggle as the survival enabling spread, preservation, and presumably creation of different literacies by marginalized groups. And you describe this as something that's necessary, essentially, in as much as privileged groups work to silence marginalized groups in order to maintain power, such that when oppressed groups articulate their struggles in the face of oppressive systems, they fight against erasure. And so the idea that you're laying out here, as I took it, is that basically one of the core elements of literacies of struggle right from the start as discourses oriented towards survival is that they fight against erasure. And they do so in a variety of different media and in a variety of different, more specific ways. And when you start saying that, I think you make a really useful distinction between dramatistic and scientistic ways of operating, so that literacies of struggle can be more scientistic or more dramatistic, and you lay out first off the scientific standpoint and kind of look through it, and I'll come back to the way that you talk about scientistic and dramatistic at the end as well. So I think all of that's awesome. I think you're thinking about it in a really interesting way. The thing that I find myself as a reader kind of looking for a little more up front is a single, clear, specific, solid definition. So in all this, I'm like, okay, so what exactly are literacies of struggle? How are you defining them? You just say what they're for. You say a little bit about different ways that they can work, and you articulate their importance, the necessity of them, but you don't actually have a single statement defining them. So that would be something that I'd be interested to see. Also, although you do broaden your way of thinking about them quite a bit at the end, still there's not a single definition. So I'd be interested to just for your own thinking. Try and write a 1-sentence, 2-sentence literacies of struggle are X, and then what is that X? So trying to kind of condense everything into just one assertion, one statement that works as a definition. I think you bring Ratcliffe in a useful way. Although I would urge you in general. So when you quote her to say, these works can, quote, help us hear discursive intersections of gender and race/ethnicity, including whiteness, so as to help us to facilitate cross-cultural dialogues. I think that that's a useful explanation of what happens when other communities are receptive. But I also kind of want to encourage you, well, unpack the quote a little bit. What's at stake there? What's at stake there for Radcliffe? How are you in agreement with her overall perspective, where this is drawn from, or not in agreement with her overall perspective, where this is drawn from? How does thinking a little more fully about what she's saying here impact or affect the argument you're making about what is possible as a response to literacies of struggle. Now, when you say that literacies of struggle can also take a dramatistic approach and explain the effects that the struggle has on those in the community, again, as a reader here, one of the things I would want to push you on is, well, okay, cool. So if you're going to take the term from Burke, come back to the original source and quote and unpack and kind of explain a little bit more what the difference is exactly between scientistic and dramatistic in Burke. So that when you carry that over, that dichotomy over as a framework for your own thinking, it's clear what actually the framework is up front. I think the way you talk about it subsequently in literacies of struggle is useful and interesting. But again, I would want to see it tethered more closely in the text that you're drawing the frame from. That's going to make it a more powerful argument. So when you talk then about how constant oppression affects the well-being of marginalized communities, and this aspect, this idea of literacies of struggle as being dramatistic, as you're laying it out here through Visner and Ansel-Dua, is more about shaping the experience of members of minoritized or marginalized communities. But then one of the things I'm sort of left asking is, okay, cool, fair enough, but what makes that approach dramatistic exactly? Why is that dramatistic and not also scientistic? You say it explains the effects that struggle has on those in the community. Isn't that still scientistic? And if the goal in both cases is changing somebody, if that's what's at stake, why isn't the former way of thinking about literacies of struggle, that's about communicating struggle to others, why isn't that also dramatistic if what's at stake in both cases is changing some audience? So again, I think this is where tethering the frame more closely to its original source, working through the difference between the two concepts, and kind of sweating the source a little bit, working through exactly what Burke said about that and the extent to which you find that useful, what exactly he means, and then using that thing that you're drawing from him in a fuller way, I think would actually kind of help answer the question of, like, well, is this here really different? Because that's what I'm sort of left asking. In this particular way. I mean, to me, it's clearly different to try and do something that's inner-directed within a community versus something that's outer-directed. But is scientistic versus dramatistic the best frame for that? And that's less clear to me than it is. And I'd have kind of a similar response in general to most of the places that you're quoting from the sources. I just want to encourage you to work the sources more. Don't just quote or just drop in a quote. But explain what that quote means and where it sits in the original source and why that's a useful perspective right here in a little bit fuller way, at the level of unpacking the quote, unpacking the original source. Right now, these are a little bit drive-by-ish. So when you come into investigating, one of the things that I'm wondering is, over and above a general description, what literacy of struggle exactly emerges here? What is the literacy of struggle that's at stake in, for instance, the sit-in at the police department? You explain the specific action, But what rhetorically is happening? What's happening in discourse, and why and how? You note that multiple outlets reported on the event following it. Did they frame the event the way that the organizers framed the event? To what extent? Why or why not? How was community discussion shaped by or not shaped by the action? And so, in general, like, I think there's more to be said there. But those are some of the questions that I kind of want to look at, or ask you to look at, is like a little more fully, like, what's happening in such moments rhetorically. What are some of the major tropes or figures that people are drawing on? So, for instance, you say here, this artifact also works at defining the movement and explaining its mission. During the sit-in, protesters called for, quote, the abolition of ICE. We demand that the undocumented community of Flagstaff be decriminalized, and most importantly, we demand that Sheriff Driscoll stop choosing to operate with ICE. End quote. With this event, they make a clear statement of what the issue is and inform the public about their demands. Okay, yeah, fine, cool. That's fair enough. But also, like, what's happening here as a statement? What way of framing the world is in stake? We would say, okay, well, there's a pointing out that undocumented people are effectively criminalized, and so there's an effort to frame interventions as decriminalizing the existence of people. There's an interesting framing when they say stop choosing to cooperate with ICE. Oftentimes law enforcement, Driscoll included, claim that their hands are tied, that they have to cooperate with ICE. In fact, that's not true. One of the efforts of this statement is to highlight that that's a choice. Anyways, there's a lot more you could say. Those are just two things I'd know. So what I would want you to do here in general, and what I would encourage you to think about, like, in these moments when you're doing rhetorical analysis, is, okay, cool, but let's go deeper. What's actually happening here rhetorically? How is this discourse working? How does it create or add to an already existing literacy of struggle? How does the literacy of struggle that it's producing work in the way that you say that it works? So they make a clear statement, okay, cool, but they're not just hoping to inform, right? They're also hoping to affect or move or change. So how do the words that they use, how do the symbols that they use affect change or fail to affect change? Now, now I think here you just have just a little bit of thinking in those terms, which is great. So by making a physical statement that causes direct repercussions, such as the obstruction of ICE and Flagstaff Police Department officials, they occupy space and shift power dynamics back into the hands of the people. Okay, so there you're thinking about, like, what's at stake in physical forms of protest, and that's cool, and that's the kind of thing I would want you to expand on more and think about more fully. The similar thing is at stake in undocuqueer. I think you do some more unpacking of literally the name of the organization, and that's cool. You explain how undocuqueer you explain that undocuqueer and unafraid reflects visitors' native survivors concept, in as much as it's a denunciation of victimry and a reclamation of power through an articulation of identity. And here's another spot where I would want to push you to say, okay, cool, but say more, explain that more fully, lay it out. And in general, that's a big part of, I hope what you're hearing in my feedback here is, I think you have a lot of good ideas and make a lot of smart connections. And I think a lot of the work that would be necessary to really push a paper like this further is the really working out of how exactly do the things that you're saying work. Why should somebody? I mean, I'm very sympathetic to your argument, but why should a person who's not or who's not familiar with these agree that these different things mean or work in the way that you say that they do? And then ultimately, what does that have to do with exactly whatever a literacy struggle is, as you define that? I think you do use this undocumented queer community as a space of pushing your initial definition further to think more about what it might mean to do dramatistic work as part of a literacy struggle, and I think that this is a really this here you're really thinking about like what's the difference between the two in a way that's useful, and then again, like, here I think we're limited a little bit by the fact that you haven't exactly unpacked the difference between scientistic and dramatistic that you're invoking. But I think it's fruitful to come back to that difference here. And one of the questions I think that's important is to say, so when you say members of marginalized communities have unique experiences that not everyone can relate to, but that should not stop people from conveying those experiences. And then you also note that trying to gain understanding from more privileged people who may never understand can also be harmful to mental health and should not be a requirement for those different literacies. I think one of the things you're saying is you're really moving beyond the initial thinking that literacy as a struggle must be outward directed. And I like the way that you kind of work through that more fully. Here and especially kind of laying out more about how you're thinking about a difference between scientistic and dramatistic. I think you do that effectively here. I think ultimately when you say the struggle covers so many different issues and concepts, and literacies of the struggle should reflect that as well. One of the things I kind of find myself really wishing for a little more here at the end is, okay, cool, but so like what once more is exactly literacy of struggle? You offer some strong closing thoughts on their vitality, how important they are, but what are they? You've broken them down into two different categories, scientistic and dramatistic, but what is this thing that you're breaking into different categories? So that's that, and I think a little more in those terms would be probably useful to you in terms of thinking about what rhetorically happens in the different instances. So those are some general thoughts about like some of the things that I think you're doing here that are really strong. And again, I want to highlight, I thought this was a really interesting piece, and that you're making a lot of smart, good connections. So this feedback isn't really meant to be like hypercritical, although some parts of what I'm saying are critical, but rather to be sort of suggesting, if you were going forward with this essay, if you're doing more with this essay, these are the kinds of things that I would be encouraging you to press on with, to think through more fully. And then also, I hope these comments are helpful as you're thinking about what does your final project do when it participates in or contributes to a literacy struggle. And I look forward to seeing that final project, and talk to you later.